Now we're going to code the state objects that the automat relies on. Remember, these state objects will be loaded into the state variable, and the state variable will have methods called on it, and those methods will do different things depending on what kind of state object is loaded into the state variable. So we're going to create the state objects now, and they have in common 4 different methods. You can call these 4 different methods anytime on a state variable. So in order to create the state classes, we're going to create an interface, first of all, that specifies what those 4 methods are. It's got application, check application, rent apartment, and dispense keys. Okay, so those are the 4 methods that every state object will have to implement, because those are the methods that will be called by the automat. So here we have the waiting state, for example. Implement state. This is the state that the automat is normally in, waiting for an application. And in order to work this, you pass the automat interface, the automat itself, to the waiting state constructor, and then it stores the automat in an object variable named automat. Then you're able to write, for example, the getApplication method. The getApplication method allows you to say, okay, we have got an application. We want to change from the waiting state to the getApplication state. You do that by working with the automat object that you've already stored. You say automat.getApplication state. So you're changing state. You set the new state of the automat to that getApplication state like this when you've got an application, and you return the text that we printed out, thanks for the application. So you see, that's the way it works. The reason you get an automat object in the constructor is so you can interface with it. You can connect to it and say automat.setState, and that sets the state of the automat, and the automat getApplication state returns a new state object, which you then set as the automat state with a setState method. And here are the other methods. You can have a check application method, a rent apartment method, and a dispense keys method. All these have different responses, different objects, depending on what the internal state is. Okay, so here is the getApplication state, and the most interesting thing here is the check application method, and that is going to use a random number and see whether or not and use that random number to determine whether or not the rental applicant has been approved or not. Congratulations, you're approved. Sorry, you're not approved. And then you have the apartment rented state, and that's the most interesting thing here is rent apartment. And you set the count you decrement the actual count of number of apartments. You set that new count to the newly decremented amount because you have now rented out an apartment. And you dispense the keys as well. And in that case, you set if you check whether or not there are still apartments left to rent, and if there are, you set the state to. If there are not, you set the state to fully rented, and if there are additional apartments to rent, you set the automat to the waiting state. You set the state of the automat to the waiting state, as you see there, and so that's how it works. You're past the automat in the constructor of every one of these states, and they can use the state methods the automat methods in order to work with the automat. Here is the fully rented state, and it just returns all the time, sorry, we're fully rented. Okay, so that's the idea. We're now using objects to hold the state. A state variable holds different state objects depending on the internal state of the automat, and always calls the same methods on that state object. But since the state object can hold different state can be of different state classes, you'll get different responses from it. And so that's an alternate way of working with the state design pattern. We'll take a look at how that works in code with test automat application, which is coming up next, and confirm that in fact we're able to hold and work with state.